Yeah, all right. It looks like we are live. Woohoo! Hey,
Woo!
everybody. I'm Kay Tempest Bradford. I am the vice chair, the steering committee of the Carl Brandon Society. And welcome, everybody, to our panel on mythology and speculative literature. Woohoo! Yay! Here. Um, all of my awesome guests are here with us. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. But before that, I'm just going to give you a tiny speech about what's going down here. So, some of you may know because you looked on the description page about the Carl Brandon Society. We are a nonprofit organization that our mission is to increase the number of people of color and increase people talking about people of color in science fiction, fantasy, horror, and speculative literature. And so we do this by supporting both authors and fans. And we have, I don't remember how many years we've been going because I haven't been there that long. But, often the way that we did the supporting in the past was by giving cons panel suggestions for panels that can include Black, Indigenous, and other people of color that weren't necessarily diversity 101 or what it's like to be, and nobody needs any of that anymore. And so now that we are in this time of COVID, we thought that we could have some virtual panels since everybody's stuck at home and everybody is learning how to use Zoom. So that we can have these virtual panels and talk about stuff that like just really digs into the things that we care about. So we reached out to people and we said, hey, what do you guys want to do panels on? And people were like, let's do a panel on this. So now we're having this panel on mythology and speculative literature. So I'm your moderator, but I'm mostly here just to ask questions and let my fabulous panelists speak because we have a collection here of intelligent and talented people, and I just want you to listen to them. So we're going to start by I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves, and then we're going to get to the first question. And I'm going to go by the order that is on my list of participants, which is not necessarily any kind of order that makes sense otherwise. So first, Shweta,
Oh,
why don't you
okay.
introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Shveta Thakrar, and I write. Oh goodness, I write fantasy that's very lush and lyrical and draws a lot on mythology. And in fact, Tempest, if I can do a plug, because I just got these.
Oh,
Look how beautiful this comes out. This is a Star
shiny.
Daughter, my young adult debut that comes out on August 11th. And it is about a girl who is half star and half human. And she has to go to the heavenly realm to find her starry mom after she accidentally wounds her human father.
Yeah, you guys, you're gonna want that book. She's gonna talk about it more, and you want it. I'm just telling you right now. All right, Piper, you're next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Piper J. Drake, and I write edgy romantic suspense, as well as some science fiction, some fantasy. And in fact, I am breaking more and more into fantasy, as we will talk about later on today. But I'm also traditionally published as well as indie published, so I consider myself a hybrid author. And that's about it for now. I think a lot more is going to come falling out of my mouth later. So,
Awesome. Kate?
I'm Kate Elliott. I've been writing since the Paleolithic, and so Kitty's laughing at me. I don't really know what to say. I've written a lot of books, science fiction and fantasy, and I'm delighted to be here today with these fabulous people who I adore you all. That's it.
Thank you. We adore you too. Rebecca?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Roanhorse. I write science fiction and fantasy with perhaps a touch of horror. I am a horror fan, kinda. I'm a little bit of a scaredy cat, but I like a lot of the tropes. Anyway, so my fantasy in particular draws heavily from indigenous mythology or traditional stories, as I like to call them. Either ones that exist or in my most recent novel that's upcoming in October called Black Sun, I create my own mythology for that world. But it is certainly inspired by indigenous mythologies. Yeah.
Awesome. And last but definitely not least, and please correct me if I pronounce this wrong, Vida?
Yeah, it's correct.
Awesome.
Hi. Okay. Hi, I'm Vida Cruz. I write, oh my God, sorry. I write mostly fantasy, and I use Philippine mythology to interrogate contemporary social issues and sort of to reclaim stories that have been lost to us because my ancestors didn't really write anything down. More on that later. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I want to start by asking a question that may be a little bit loaded, but I wanted to begin by talking about how you each define mythology, because there's a sort of like popular conception of like what is mythology, but then there's academic distinctions between mythology and folklore and fairy tale and whatnot. So when we're talking about mythology here, what do each of you mean when you say I utilize mythology, I read a lot of mythology, I create mythologies in my world? Does anybody in particular want to start with that?
Sure, I'll
Shveta?
go. Or Shveta, go.
Well, I was going to say, as an amateur folklorist, I see the word myth as a sacred story, whether it's a creation story or some other sacred story. And so for me, and I am a practicing Hindu, so I think I forgot to say in my introduction that I draw a lot on Hindu mythology and Hindu and Buddhist folklore. But yes, so that's interesting because yes, the popular conception of myth, right, is a lie. We say the myth about something and we mean that in a derogatory way. But for me, at least in real world terms, it would be sacred story, something that people often still believe in.
Piper?
I think for me, when I think myth and when I speak about myth, it's a bit of a broader term. I, growing up, searched out every iteration of mythology or folklore or folk tales, and I searched on all of those terms to be able to catch the various stories, to be able to consume them hungrily, because I love the mythology. And sometimes that mythology would be tied up into religion, and other times it would be tied up into beliefs of the hearth and beliefs of the home, or in plant life and gardening, or in ways of life and culture that were not necessarily as tied to religion. So I think for me, when I spoke about mythology to other people or shared stories or incorporated it in my work, it was a much more broader umbrella of the term of stories, but always hopefully in a positive light, or in a shall we say a lessons learned, which is what we find a lot of those stories being.
Anyone else can just jump in?
You want me to? I just wanted to follow up what Piper said. As a child and a teen, I read mythology obsessively because, and in fact, I remember once having a debate with my brother about this very issue. I said that if we look at the stars and we think that they're the campfires of a vast conglomeration of people who are gathering together, is that less meaningful than saying that they're giant balls, and then the scientific explanation? And he has said, well, of course it's less meaningful because it's not true. And I said, well, how is it not true? I was trying to work this out in my own head, this idea that mythology is also about cosmology. It's about how people understand the universe. And then at the same time, as I got into college and studied things, I also began to see how mythology was a way of, that academic mythology could be a way of diminishing indigenous beliefs and trying to putting them in a little file folder, rather than also seeing them as just as big as this other way of looking at the universe.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that I think of mythology as foundational stories for a culture, often coming from oral traditions. And so, just like Kate said, these are the stories that tell you who you are and how you function in the universe. And certainly those values are just as important as scientific values for your average human. And so maybe true, not true is such a loaded sort of a question, or sort of a loaded way to like weigh mythology. And like one of the books I've written for children called Race to the Sun was on the Rick Riordan imprint. And of course, he works in Greek and Egyptian and Norse mythologies. And we talked about how to define what mythology is at the beginning of in his little sort of, introduction. And the thing, that he wanted to say was that for him, these are stories about heroes and gods, and that's, sort of about it. That there's no value attached to them, negative or positive. At least that's how I understood, what he was saying. But these are these epic sort of stories, these quests and, traditions that have survived thousands of years sometimes. So they have to have some importance. They have to mean something if they've lasted this long and they still resonate with people.
Okay, so jumping in on what everyone else said, I think that mythology is a record of a certain culture's beliefs over time, but because maybe you're removed via time and via culture, the context gets stripped away. And maybe if you're not within the culture, you'll never truly know the whole context. But for me, it's been a real journey trying to uncover the context of my own culture, because the more I find out about the different mythologies in my country, the more I want to find out, but what does this mean? What does this stand for? That sort of thing.
And another thing that was touched on is how mythology is often applied to stories or cultural aspects or even religious or spiritual stories that are outside of what may be considered the dominant paradigm of who's looking. So in Western culture and American and Western European culture, that usually means that like Christianity doesn't get labeled as having mythology while other cultures have mythology. So can any of you speak a little to how you address that both within your own dealings with mythology and also how you begin to address that in your work?
Yeah, well, I'll just say something. I think absolutely Christianity has mythologies. They just happen to be written down, and so 1,000 years gives them some weight, and their popularity, gives them a certain kind of weight in larger Western tradition. Whether you be a Christian or not, whether you follow that particular religion or not, it's sort of it is all around you. It permeates the culture. It permeates the way we think about gender relationships. It permeates the way we think about class and race and all sorts of things. But so much of it, yes, is definitely a mythology. I have a religious studies background, which I won't go into, but I went to seminary even, and even among us, I have a terminal master's degree in theology, and even among theologians, Christian theologians, there's an acknowledgement that yes, this is mythology. This stuff was mythologized, and then finally written down, during a certain era, and therefore it carries a weight that perhaps oral traditions we don't give that same weight. But yeah, of course.
I'd agree. When it comes down to it, a lot of my early life becoming familiar with mythologies from different religions, I read a lot of maybe beginning tales from Christianity, in addition to like the early life of the parents of the Thai take on Buddhism and how Buddha was born and how reached enlightenment, right? Like, so I read those tales in parallel, and to me, they held a similar amount of insight into why teachings are what they are today and what some of the backstory and context are. But to me, they held very similar weight. Whereas if I tried to discuss it with classmates or anybody else of my age group at that time, they were like, well, yeah, but that stuff is just, it's fiction. And this is religion, and thus it is true. We learned this in insert your religious school, and it didn't matter that I on a particular day of the week also went to school to learn about my culture and my my religion. they just didn't give it the same way. It's true. But to me, and the way that my parents didn't put pressure on me to choose a particular religion, it was all just amazing, beautiful, gorgeous stories. And they were presented really beautifully and well across an abundance of religions. And I think the only frustration I had in a lot of ways was that there weren't more representative cultures and religions where I could consume stories like that and get more understanding of their beliefs and the context around why they had some of the basic tenets that they had, or the basic principles they had, as the foundation of their learning and the morals and ethics that their society and their behavior was built around.
I'm really intrigued because of what Rebecca said, and also you, Piper, too. But like, I would have double majored in religious studies if it had been offered at my college, but it wasn't. So it's really interesting that we're all here with this really deep, I don't want to say attraction to, but connection to spiritual and other forms of connecting to how we look at the universe. I did a little bit of research before I came, and I looked up the etymology of the word mythos, which is either Greek or pre-Greek, and it means, according to Oxford, whatever, it means speech, thought, word, discourse, conversation, anything delivered by word of mouth. Which I find fascinating. So that's the stories, it's like how we share it, how we share our understanding of the world between each other. It's not until the mid-19th century that, according to Oxford, that the sense of it being untrue story, imaginary or fictitious object starts being used. So that would be the Victorian era, which would be that period when saying, well, it's not that people didn't think, yeah, right? And that's to me, that's very British Empire. No, we're the only truth. The rest of you, that's cute, but, right? So it's interesting.
The
If I
Victorian
can jump
era
on that.
has so much to answer for. Anyway, yes, continue.
Yes, well, that's why I spoke up, right? Like, my ancestors were very directly affected by the British Empire. And I mean, I don't know how much our listeners know about Hindu mythology, for example, but it's a bunch of traditions that got put together under one umbrella, and it's very rich and contradictory, as mythology often is. But the British came sailing in, and they were basically like, what is this savagery, and we will turn you backward people around, and it's just very interesting and angering to me how that imperial thinking lingers on even today. Like, Rebecca had that wonderful answer just now a few minutes ago, and I totally agree with that and Piper too, like that we get told our own sacred stories are nothing. Like, I got told when I was a kid, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I got told, I think I was like 8 years old, and I was in the grocery store, and some well-meaning white lady came up to me and told me I was going to burn in hell because I wasn't a Christian. And only that you can only feel okay. Yeah, right. You can only feel okay saying things like that if you've been taught that, of course, your way is the right way and there can be no other way. And so, of course, everybody else's beliefs and traditions are, like you said, fiction, Piper, mythology, not, whereas Christianity, being the dominant tradition, dominant faith in the West, is of course going to be the right one, the one that saves everybody else, while the rest of us obviously just don't know any better.
Okay, I want to jump in on that one. In the Philippines, where I live, we're, I guess, 80% Catholic and 20% Muslim. And then Catholicism was brought here by the Spanish. And I just want to share how my ancestors dealt with that, because if you look at Philippine Catholicism, it's very, very different from the kind of Catholicism you see anywhere else in the world, because there are a lot of pagan elements. And the reason for that is when the friars came over and they were trying to convert my ancestors, they were like, Son of God died and came back to life. And my ancestors were like, oh, our God did that too. So eventually, what happened here was that we'd have sacred stories where Catholic figures became the heroes instead. So I've encountered a bunch of myths that were Catholicized, but still retain this kind of wild undercurrent of indigenousness, if that is a word.
If
And
it's
just
not, we can make it a word.
and to follow that, I think that's so exciting because I think, and you sort of touched on this, I think, Tibbist, at your introduction, mythology can be subversive. Like the use of mythology, the reclaiming of mythology, centering traditional stories and mythologies is a way to speak back to colonization, is a way to reclaim space, even in, or particularly in science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction. Uh, and when you see things like Vita's talking about, because it's the same in my in New Mexico, the tribes here, like the Pueblo that I'm descended from, are very Catholic. Because we took that Catholicism and we merged it with our own stories. Yeah, our God did that too. Isn't that exciting? We can put those together, and so that just shows too that mythology is alive. It's not just old, dusty stories that happened thousands of years ago or something like that. It is living, it is breathing, just like the cultures are. It's ever changing. And I think where that's happening, or at least what I'm trying to do a lot in my work, is to reclaim those spaces and to take some of those stories and make them accessible in a way to younger readers, or perhaps folks that didn't grow up in their traditional cultures or didn't hear a lot of these stories. And so many of the stories are just good storytelling too, like gods and heroes and monsters and all this sorts of stuff that appeals, because I think mythology is happening in popular culture, whether it be that they've taken Norse mythology and created Thor movies, and so that's your superheroes now, or they've created wholesale just new mythologies, that we follow, Iron Man or something. But so traditional stories have all those elements too, and when we can bring them forward and sort of retell them or modernize them, I think that's exciting. I think that keeps the culture alive and thriving.
I actually want to jump off of that, if that's okay. And Rebecca, I absolutely agree. One of the things that I love and I'm delighted by is when you find references to mythology in genres that people aren't really expecting to see them in, and in different ways, almost like Easter eggs, right? Like, so I was fortunate enough to read an upcoming young adult contemporary romance by Pintip Dunn, who is also a Thai American author. And she had cute, adorable Easter eggs of some of my favorite myth and mythology. And like, for example, one was the one of Ramasun and Mekhala, which is one of my favorite stories to tell people when they're like, oh, I bet you don't ever want to go back and live in Thailand because of that whole, patriarchal society and submissive females, because you don't look like someone who could really deal with submissive females. And I'm like, oh, that's a huge misconception to where a lot of culture and a lot of identity comes from when it comes to a lot of Asian countries and Asian cultures. So that perception is one it's really dangerous stereotype. So Ramakian and Mekhala is one of my favorites because it is a myth about a nymph who's running through the clouds, playing in the clouds, and Ramasun, who's a guy who really would like to capture this nymph for his own. And he keeps trying to catch her by laming her because she's like, nope, don't wanna. And she goes flitting away. And he tries to lame her with his hammer. And that's the sound of thunder in the skies. But our Mekhala can defend herself. And she has this ball of lightning that she can wield to throw out lightnings, and it spoils his aim. And she goes flitting along and running away perpetually, which is why lightning is always ahead of thunder in the mythology. And that's so much, to me, if you perceive it, depending on how you spin it, the perception you can have on that story is that it's very much an old folktale or mythology in which girl gets to choose or girl's gone, and I apologize because that's a very binary story, but you can still apply that to just any person in matters of love. You choose or you leave. Need not stay, need not be trapped, need not be, nobody is entitled to your love. Right. And I love that mythology to share with people because of this whole conception of, oh, but all of those stories feature submissive females. Not so.
They don't. So all of you have used mythology in your work in some way. So my next question is, just dig in a little bit of like how you are or have used mythology. What are some of the challenges that you came across in either trying to fit the mythology into a fictional context, right? Like the mythology is not a lie, but there's fiction that we're doing here, and how you work out culturally how to do things, how to shape things, and places where you might not decide to go. So Shveta, why don't we start with you?
How did I know you were going to do that? Um, that's a really good question, and something I've wrestled with, because all of us here are writing primarily in the North American market, where people are not necessarily familiar with the source material we're drawing from. And that can be a bit iffy, because not only do people for some strange reason have this assumption that when marginalized people write about their cultures or their mythologies, they're not taking the same liberties that white writers would be. And so clearly what we're writing is a textbook that you can learn from. And I've seen a lot of reviews that have just really upset me about other books where they're like, well, this didn't have enough of the culture for my taste, or this, and I'm just thinking, but that's not what it's for. It's a novel. And also, then there's also the problem too, that when you are drawing on these mythologies that people here, for the most part, might not be so familiar with outside of the group that you come from, and sometimes not even then, because sometimes if you grew up here, you don't learn as much as you might have otherwise. I know that was the case for me. So then there's a question of, am I doing this justice, and is this going to add to a problem of negative representation, even if that's not what I'm doing? Are people going to look at this and assume that they suddenly know my religion or whatever the case may be, and judge from that? And I mean, for me personally, I like to think that I'm writing loving fan fiction of the gods of the stories, but I also can understand why somebody else might feel that was being too flippant with them, especially if they haven't gotten the same traction and respect here that they could have. So I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts on this.
Piper?
I talk a lot, so I wanted to give everybody a chance to get a word in edgewise. So in my case, introducing mythology in romantic suspense is something that people aren't necessarily looking for mythological references, unless, it's an Indiana Jones situation, or, the National Treasure situation, where the mythology and chasing down the mythology is a part of the suspense plot. But in the first time I gave this a try, because it actually took me a while to work up through my books into bringing more and more of my Thai culture and heritage into the books, because I was afraid I was going to get it wrong and my mom was going to call me out because she reads my books. Mom first, everybody else in the world in terms of audience next, okay? But I tried it in Finding His Mark, which was a novella that has an Asian American heroine who also happens to be an assassin, hiding out in Thailand due to situations globally. And the way that I had the mythology incorporated is that it was through the experience of these foreigners coming for a business conference and asking questions about statues that they saw there, iconography that they saw there, and her saying, based on what I was told as a child and the stories that I heard as a child, this is the myth and the mythology. And then the final climax, and her identifying her mark, because she is, as an assassin, brought in to find the other assassin. How to identify the other assassin. And I bring in one of my absolute favorite Thai dances, which is also a Thai dance meant to depict a chapter, a part of an epic story of a bird princess, Manora. And they dance with Tonlep, which is the Thai dance has the long gold fingernails. And she notices that one of the Thai dancers has her fingernails backwards to flip like claws, which makes them very tipped for naughty, poisonous things. So she engages that particular Thai dancer. But in that stage of the storyline, Menorah is one of 7 bird princesses, all dressed the same. So you're literally looking at a line of very similarly dressed Thai dancers and looking for something wrong, something out of place. And that's when she notices the fingernails in the dance. And so I had to pull it into a romantic suspense plot in some way and creatively, because this was a romantic suspense and the mythology wasn't the map to find the treasure, right? So that was kind of a challenge. And now I'm writing as a super secret project that's not super secret because I've talked about it, a Thai mythology inspired second world fantasy. And it's a completely different ballpark. I'm not using a character to tell a story the way that they heard it or I heard it as a kid. I'm writing all new, and I love Shveta's term of fan fiction based on my love of these stories, and it's influenced by, but it is second world fantasy. It's not meant to be here. I'm not retelling these specific mythologies. I'm yoinking my favorite characters and my favorite mythological creatures as inspirations for what I'm building in this world. So total turnaround in how I'm handling mythology in each of those genres.
Rebecca, did you want to go next, or?
I thought that was a nice segue into creating our own mythology, so I was just gonna like pass that to Kate or something. Yeah, I have a comment, but I'll make it later.
Okay.
I think
was.
Vida raised her hand too.
Oh,
Yeah.
Vida.
Yeah, go ahead.
In this kind of, in this, what do you call this, line of work, I'm in a really weird position where I have to try and make Philippine mythology appealing to a Western audience, but it's a really roundabout way for me to try and get my own people to read them, because we have distribution problems here in my country. And I figured if I try to get onto like a Western platform, maybe more people will see it, because there's also this, what comes into play here is we tend to think as a culture that if it's foreign, it's better. And I really hate that. So anyway, one way I've tried to do that is a few years ago, I retold Beauty and the Beast, but using creatures from Philippine mythology. So Beauty is a diwata, which is like mountain goddess. Oh my God, that's a spoiler, but never mind, it's online anyway. That's Odd and Ugly on Podcastle. Anyway, and the Beast is Capre, and that was also, it's a tree giant, by the way. Some people seem to think that means Groot, but no, it's a giant living in a tree. Anyway, there was an opportunity for me also to discuss resistance and post-colonialism, because the Capra has a really racist beginning from my research. It came to life because the Spaniards would bring over Black slaves to build the universities and the walled cities. And whenever one of them would escape, the way the friars would tell the locals not to help them is to say that there are big scary monsters in the trees who smoke cigarettes, don't help them. And I wanted to address that in the story that I wrote. And also I wanted to talk a little bit about revolution and how we were trying to take back our country from late stage Spanish colonialism, which also comes into play later in that story. And so I did manage to sneak it past, censors, gatekeepers, whatever. And maybe more people will read that and feel an appreciation for what we've got. But another way I'm trying to do it, and I'm not so sure if I've done it successfully, is I'm trying, like Piper, to make secondary world fantasy out of Philippine mythology. And this is more difficult than I thought, because there are so many things that I don't know about the different cultures of the Philippines where all these stories came from. And I'm afraid of stepping on other people's toes. But at the same time, I want to I just want to take people's heads and go, look, this is beautiful, this is numinous, this is wonderful, and we should appreciate it before it goes away. And it's a little bit sad that I have to dress it up a bit just to make it a bit more appealing.
Oh my gosh, may I break in for just a minute? I'm so sorry. Is it okay? Okay, so I so feel that, because a lot of Thai mythology that I grew up learning was literally oral and my mom telling me these stories. Literally, like we would be in Thailand, we would visit Wat Prakao, and we would walk through the ancient temple, and on the walls were the murals of the Ramakien, which has very, very, very strong parallels to the Ramayana, which I may be pronouncing incorrectly. But the Ramakien, my mom would tell it to me. And because my mom told it to me, there's all of these side stories that really, really have a very strong, independent female power message to it, which is kind of fun. But when I decided to take on this second world fantasy idea, one of the first sources that I could go to, because there's just not a lot of written sources out there, and if there are, they're not by Thai people, was my mom. You know, and asking my mom if there's any universities or professors, and she's like, I'll look for them. But if anybody has ever asked their mom anything, it's like that takes some time, right? And so you talk to your mom, and I'm talking to my mom about this stuff. She's like, I'll think about it. But the thing is that stories come out of my mom randomly. So later on, we're at a breakfast buffet. My two tiny nephews, 2.5 and 4.5, are playing around us, you know, asking for an international buffet. So they've got kotom over here, and then, which is the soft-boiled rice porridge, and then they've got pancakes over here, and they got scrambled eggs, and they have to have an omelet with manchego cheese, please. No processed cheese, apparently, with my nephews. And then suddenly my mom goes, oh yes, I remember these mythological creatures as well. Do you remember them? They're these females that grow from trees as fruit, and they were really placed there by a demigod to be able to satisfy the hungers of men who could not behave themselves. And I'm like, Mommy, first of all, that's lovely. I really need to take that note because I have an idea for that. But this is not the place. We're in a public international buffet next to my nephews, and you're talking about women who have no power of consent, who are the perfect image of physical beauty, made specifically to feed the hunger of people who, this is why we can't have nice things. Like, what? And that's how I was stumbling across different mythological creatures. And I'm like, you never mentioned this in all of the years, and now I'm 42, and you've mentioned this at breakfast, and I almost choked on my pancake. Like, what is happening? And it was in Thailand. And so we had some international visitors looking over, like, what are you two doing? And then I Wikipedia'd it, and the name that she had like a tiny Wikipedia reference that had like 3 sentences, which was nowhere near as in depth as the details that my mom could give me on all of this stuff. And I'm like, so my primary source is still my mother.
I think that that's a great primary source somehow. Kate, did you want to jump in?
There's actually, it strikes me, 2 things going on here that you can do in science fiction and fantasy. And one is this incorporating known historical, indigenous mythologies and cosmologies, either directly or indirectly, and like pouring them through to make something that you would set in a secondary world. And then the other thing is coming up with a mythology or a cosmology that isn't directly related to a specific culture. Nothing we do is not related to Earth and to who we are and to what our experience is there. It's not possible. But I'm going to leave that second one for a second and go. My own experience most strongly was in Crown of Stars, which is 7-volume epic fantasy set in a version of early medieval Europe. And there were a couple of things I did with that. One is that the reality is stranger than the surface stereotypes that were told, always. And if you can dig down, whether through your mom's stories or the stories of people who have, you know, a long tradition of telling stories, or through really good academic work, people who are like digging into the sources and finding the obscure things people wrote back in the day, there's it's like a wealth of experience and strangeness that I think that when it's in the past, I think it's a little easier to draw on and not feeling that you're exploiting someone, because a lot of what writers do, especially white writers in colonialist systems, is exploitation, or can be, if it's done in a transactional way rather than in a relationship way. That's the best way I can think of phrasing it. But the other thing about early medieval Europe is it's another place where indigenous cultures with their own indigenous belief systems were being slowly but surely overrun by this overarching, this slow spread of Christianity, which always incorporated, or in the early days would often incorporate the indigenous beliefs to bring those people in. So you would have, a lot of this has vanished because of the way Catholicism was then overlaid by Protestantism. And that a lot of stuff has kind of vanished from sight because of that. But if you look at early medieval Europe's Christianity, it's kind of different, so you have the Christianity in Roman Britain was with its Celtic influences, and then the way the Norse people incorporated it, and the way the Slavs, which came they converted much later, and there were several crusades to convert them. It's fascinating. And then, in my case for Crown of Stars, I took that actual setting, this setting of conflict between culture and religion, and as part of it. And I think when you find those points of conflict and those points of fracture, there's a lot of story in there.
Definitely true. Now, Rebecca, I know that you wanted to talk a bit about creating mythologies in work. So did you want to jump to that, or do you also want to talk about how you've used existing mythologies in your work first?
Oh, I'll talk about creating mythologies. I think one of the things that Shveta said that I wanted to just emphasize, because I really identify with, is this idea that people look at, particularly at stories by people of color, and think, oh, well, you just must be telling, the facts or something. Like, we're not allowed to be fantastical. We're not allowed to have imaginations and to create things, often sort of whole cloth, because we made that shit up. I hope I can say that. But yes, and so one of the things that I'm excited to do, particularly with Black Sun, which is my new book, is make stuff up. And so while Black Sun is my epic fantasy, this is my first sort of take on creating a secondary world that's big and both in scope and scale, but maybe a little bit more intimate in relationship and humanity. But that world building aspect, I wanted to create a world that felt like it had a history, not a specific history to any particular specific culture, because I didn't want it to be a one-on-one. I didn't want people to be like, oh, well, this is what happened to the Maya, so here's what happened in your story, like that sort of thing. I wanted it to feel familiar, or not familiar, maybe that's not the word. I wanted it to feel like these were the maritime Maya. I wanted it to feel like these are ancestral Puebloan. But so being inspired by those cultures and those stories, and then creating something sort of whole cloth, something sort of new, that is based in imagination, as opposed to fact, I guess.
I just want to jump in, because that's exactly what white writers have been allowed to do with Europe forever, right? Forever.
Right. Yes. And somehow, writers of color have not, I think. And so, this is maybe our time. Like, maybe we get to do a little bit of that. And that's exciting. Yeah. And I pushed back a little. Someone had tagged Black Sun as own voices. And that's, I get it. Absolutely. I get that. That's fine. It's in order to get it into like indigenous hands, to be reviewed, native reviewers. But I pushed back a little bit on that, only because that feels so, we get limited, we get pigeonholed into, oh, we can only now write own voices, and each of our stories is just, the Native experience or the Black experience, or, this sort of thing that feels almost too weighty. And particularly if you're writing speculative fiction, it just doesn't seem fair. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to get at there, but I would love for Black and Indigenous and POC authors to be able to be as fantastical and as out there and as creative as Kate said, as white authors have allowed to be since the beginning of the genre.
And for any of you who have also created mythologies for your works, if you've done so, what are the sort of ways you've gone about doing that? Do you start from a place of taking direct inspiration, or do you start from a place where you're like, I made up this stuff in my head, I can't wait to tell you, it's so great?
Guys, I can go on all day, which I will not, but
no, do it.
But I won't. But anyway, Crossroads. My previous books to Crossroads had more of a connection to, they weren't set in Europe or set on Earth, but they had more of a connection to direct. You could see the linkages between them and the mythology and history I was using. But with Crossroads, I wanted to write a completely secondary world. And in my early stages of developing this, back on the late lamented Genie and the very early bulletin board, I ended up having a conversation with this dude. And I don't know who he was listening to on the radio, but he proclaimed that only monotheism is ethical. And I said, I am going to write ethical polytheism as my religion for this one, the area that most of the story is based. And that was, the whole thing grew out of that. And it's, again, I can't write a completely made up, there is no such thing in my mind to a completely made up mythology, I'm going to be influenced by what's around me. I'm going to be influenced by what I know, which is why I think it's important for people to either go deep or go wide, right? Read a lot or really read deep so you're like an expert. Because that's what you have to draw on when you're writing. So I created a polytheism, and then I wove it into the culture, and it became important that the religion and the culture were woven together so that it wasn't a typical fantasy, we wear the red, cardinal robes and oppress everybody. It was woven, I would like to say, woven like a loom organically into the way the culture functioned. And that was kind of my basis for it. And I wanted to show how religion, cosmology, and society work together to create a platform for how people live and how they relate to each other.
Because that's how it works in real life. That's how it always has worked. Anyone else work with creating mythologies?
I'll say something. So what I do is I try to pick a culture that is the foundation of what I want to do, just so that I'm not making stuff up from scratch, because that's almost impossible. And then, because I see mythology as very values-based, what I do is I come up with 3 values that I can build a culture around. So that's a nurtured value, a suppressed value, and a fulfillment value. And that also works when you're making up characters, but I usually use this for cultures that I'm building. So the nurtured value is positive or negative values that arise from their interaction with their physical and societal environment. Suppressed value is what value is suppressed when this culture is angered or offended. And the fulfillment value is what is this value that the culture must honor or suffer feeling out of sync with themselves if they don't honor it. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's deep. Thank you. Rebecca, did you want to jump in?
Oh, I'll just say like what for Black Sun, what I did is I started with the pre-Columbian sort of Mesoamerican cultures and North American cultures were very focused on cosmology. They were astronomer priests really, and so I wanted to create a mythology that was centered around that and those values, and that would permeate everything the way that it did that culture or those cultures plural, from architecture to the seasons to the way that you lived your life. So I was focused on the solstice and an eclipse, and then everything sort of went back, spooled out from that. That was the center. If we were going to explain this, how would we explain it? What would be, sort of the mythologies that would support that within the culture, and how would that all work? So that was where I started.
Anyone else?
So I have a couple of different thoughts. That's why I was like waiting, because I don't want to eat up too many people's time. When it comes to my Thai mythology, second world fantasy, I thought a lot about the history of certain groups coming from a mythology, a mythological story. So their history, many generations back, comes from this story that they've developed from, or that's their background, or that's their family story. And that's how I let the mythology inspire me and then take me forward, and how the culture became more ingrained, or some of the choices that their culture made, or they as a society made, was driven by both their history and that mythology, and the choices that they make in the magic system, which was another thing that I built. And building magic systems can be this whole different aspect of stuff, right? But you have to actually get to a point where it's meshed in. And I wanted to build a magic system that went hand in hand and tied into where the mythology influenced the way that these groups of characters were developed through the course of my story. So that's one way that it influenced my second world fantasy. And I think where I've seen it done in really cool ways, if I can shout out some other books. One really older book called Reef Song by Carol Severance, that was inspired. She was based out of the Hawaiian Islands, and it was a really cool sci-fi. And in particular, the mythology was cool because you had a colony of humans on a new planet, and they took quite a few Polynesian beliefs and mythologies and pulled them all together in their story to create a new culture in this new home. And literally one of the main characters came up with her own story of how these gods decided to latch onto a spaceship and fly across the stars and found the seas of this new planet. And the way that they touched that mythology and brought that mythology over, so it still gave a nod to the roots of those mythological stories, but the character was a young girl. She was like 10, 12, somewhere in there, 14, I don't know, somewhere in the preteen area. And she's just making this mythology her own. She's taking ownership for it. And I love the way that the author did that. Other aspects of the story, well, everybody can read and choose on your own, but that aspect of the mythology I really liked. And then if you look at some other authors that we know, I know that I've been meaning to read a series that's urban fantasy by Ceresia Glass, and it's an urban fantasy set in Atlanta, right? But so it's a supernatural Atlanta, and it pulls on Egyptian gods. But yes, I knew that would get Tempest. But the idea here is that you have the sons of Anubis, who are jackal shapeshifters. And so it pulls on the mythology, but it pulls into an urban fantasy, paranormal romance. And so I thought that was a really cool series that I have on my TBR, and I've been dying to read, because that's a really cool way to pull mythology into your story and inspired by, but kind of creating your own mythology of what is now, even though it has its roots in prior. Same thing with Osa Maria Bradley. She is Western mythology, but she took a spin on Nordic mythology and Freya's Meadow and made it in her paranormal romance series, incorporated, and she played up the idea and the concept of shield maidens that fought next side by side with warriors. And she really pulls that into her mythology as well. And again, it's taking the not so defined points in mythology and making it her own in her story and taking ownership for it and growing it out. And I think that that's a good way to do it too, particularly if you're drawn to mythology that maybe is a little bit more, people are looking into it more. And I think that we find that even with Eastern mythologies, like some people are starting to get a taste for or think that they know more. So they're going to be calling that stuff out more. And so I think that a method that you can use is either having its roots and developing it further in your story, or you can take parts that aren't as well defined and make it your own, knowing that it's fiction. I mean, or you could just go bonkers and create a whole new setting for this mythology and this pantheon. Like Greek mythology is one that a lot of people know, and in fact, we're kind of trying to break away from. But one of the fresh takes that I liked about it, and I would love to see this done with Eastern mythology, is Katie Robert writes very, very, very hot, very hot romance, and it's actually contemporary romance, but she built a modern day Olympus that has no magic, and the titles of the gods are passed down through family line, or certain titles are won by right of combat or right of some other type of conflict, whether it's intellect or what have you. And so now suddenly you have these kind of mob families in a mythological kind of Gotham style city. And that's the way that the pantheon is brought out. And so you get these stories and this mythology that you're familiar with, and like we've seen Disney movies on it, but it's a modern city. And it's got this really Lore Olympus favor to it if you ever read webtoons, but like no magic. Gods aren't shape-shifting and happy tuning and like spawning small children everywhere. The titles of the Greek gods are carried down through the family line, or inherited titles, or they're passed down by some other rite of passage. And I love that concept, and I love the way that she took that really well-known mythology and she made it her own mythology, and she also created her own contemporary Batman-style city to have it in with these like mobs.
So do me a favor while I'm asking the next question. Type in all of the titles that you mentioned, because we're going to put them in the chat in YouTube for the people who missed them, because like now like we're building a TBR list. This is great. All right. And also, speaking of the people on YouTube watching, hi everybody. After I ask this next question, you guys are going to have a chance to ask questions. So put in your questions and I'm going to pick my favorites. But my next question actually jumps a little bit off, because Piper talked about the books that she has read or has heard of that seem to do this well. But what are some of the things that the aspects of mythology building or mythology use in published works that you think don't work so well? And you can name titles, or you can just talk about, general things that the people aren't doing well. And this again can be either use of an existing mythology, or mistakes that people have made in creating mythologies that you think that other writers should avoid. Let's start with Kate, and then Shveta.
I'm going to start in because I've got one. All people believe this, and they believe it in the same way.
That's not
realistic. Don't do that.
Shveta?
Okay, I've some of you have heard me go off about this book before, and I'm going to go off about it again. The Song of Kali by Dan Simmons. It trashes my goddess Kali and makes her this bloodthirsty monster, and everybody who worships her horrible and evil. And it's pretty clear. I mean, I know that he wrote it as a hate letter to his time, Dan Simmons, to his time in India. He said this somewhere. But even if I hadn't known that, it would have been obvious. And it goes to show again, and Tempest, I'm going to do a little plug for you here. It goes to show why you really should know what the hell you're talking about before you appropriate other people's stuff. And if you want to learn how to do it well, take Tempest Writing the Other course, because I was so excited. I was in my early 20s, I remember. And I'd been looking around for books because it started to occur to me, like, where are the stories that I grew up with? How come I never see them anywhere? And so when I saw this in a bookstore, I got so excited, and I went and read it later, and it just crushed me. It was like a punch in the face. And yeah, so don't do that. Like, if you're going to borrow other people's stuff, like Kate said, read really deeply, like go really, like make yourself an expert, and still accept that you're still not going to know what you're talking about in the same way that an insider would.
Rebecca?
Just as a general principle, I might say that don't make all your mythologies static. That they happened long ago, and that the beliefs have not changed or have not evolved. Just remember, cultures are always changing, always evolving. They're alive, and everything, all the outside influences that can happen can come in and change what the initial sort of culture was. So just keep that in mind. When you're creating mythologies, make them a living, breathing sort of thing.
Yeah. Vida?
Me? All right. I guess this is a trope that I dislike, and sorry if anybody writes this, but I really hate it when you have a teen from the modern day, usually American, sorry, and they get inserted into a new world that has, like, mythology is alive, old mythology is alive, and then they're commenting on everything and from a place where we're superior. I hate that. I really, really hate that. So I stay away from stories that do that, because it reminds me of how there are all these outsiders who take stories of these people and then write them down, but also annotate them with comments like, "Oh, this is primitive, this is savage," all that jazz. Please don't do that.
Yeah, for sure. Piper, do you have any?
I think that I would love for readers to keep in mind that mythological characters or creatures have different perceptions or different origins, depending on the region where the actual story came from. So no single race owns a mythological creature or person or character in mythology. So for example, one of the ones that I saw out there was the concept of Naga, because she who will not be named kind of took ownership of that, particularly in recent books, and there was some discussion around it. And what I started to see was some dangerous side discussions that took away from the main discussion of calling her out because of the inappropriateness of her statements or whoever was on her social media. These side discussions of no, Naga are from this culture, no, Naga are from this culture. But the thing is that those mythological creatures feature in quite a lot of mythology. Like Thai mythology has a take on Nagas that I haven't necessarily seen specifically, in characteristics that I haven't seen in other cultures. While they have some shared characteristics, they also have some differences. Mermaids are a great example. Mermaids are in a bunch of different cultures, and they're different from a bunch of different cultural aspects. So to say that this mythological creature, because you're not as used to hearing about it, only belongs to this culture is something that I really hope that readers will try to keep an open mind and try not to do that. Like read this take on this mythology, read this take. And if you love it, awesome. If that's not your favorite, that's fine too. Right? Like I've seen some takes on unicorns, and I love some, and I'm not so happy about others. And you know what? I remember which ones are my favorite unicorns, and I remember which ones are my not. Dragons, also the thing. Okay. So if we can recognize that dragons are in a number of cultures, and there's a lot of different takes on dragons, and they're recreated in a bajillion different ways in speculative fiction, please give us that for other mythological creatures and characters.
Can I just add, because I want to specifically, what all of you said is this idea of boundaries, but people don't stay in boundaries. People move. And like if you look at the Naga, you look at this diffusion or development across double places. I mean, we don't stick in one little discrete place, and neither do cultures. And one of the ways to look at creating a secondary world is this idea that things will move into other places and they'll meet and they'll change, as Rebecca said. And now you'll have all these variations.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things I try to impart to my students, especially the students in the world building class, is how much the idea that everybody was in their own separate little boxes until like yesterday. Like, no, that's it's literally never been that way. But it's a prevalent idea from the West. I think that's probably where it emerges, that like everybody was all in their own little boxes up until very recently. But that's actually not how things work. All right, so we have a question. It says, when writing in / inspired by the myths of a colonized people, how do you deal with including or weeding out aspects of the colonizer, especially if it's been a hybrid culture for hundreds of years? Anybody want to take that first?
Well, I think what I just heard Kate say is that you don't.
I was gonna say that too, you don't.
Yeah, that you talk about it. Yeah, you can say, hey, this is where this came from, or this is where that came from, within, sort of the culture. But just because there's an outside influence it's not corrupting per se, because that suggests there's some sort of purity to the original. And I think that's false as well, because again, just what Kate said, cultures have been intermingling and like mixing since there were cultures to begin with, with the more nomadic peoples generally. So yeah, you use that, you play with that, you comment on that, you make that part of the story.
I have something I can add.
Yeah.
Years ago, actually, 10 years ago or so, I was able to go on 2 different major trips, one to Mali in West Africa and one to Cambodia and Thailand. But one of the things I noticed specifically in Cambodia and Mali, which both have, and Thailand does as well, but in Cambodia and Mali, Cambodia's stone carving tradition, which is phenomenal. And I was in Siem Reap, which is where the Angkor complex is, with this just unbelievable. I've never seen anything as unbelievable as the stone carving there. And so, of course, there were a lot of artisans and craftspeople who did that to sell. And in Mali as well, which has this amazing set of textile traditions, that this was people who were skilled at this work. There in Mali, there was more of Mali is so focused on textiles that there was more of a local, that was really more of a local thing, but so they had their own local tradition and people wore everything that was being made. But there was also some that was being sold specifically to tourists. And in both those cases, what was being sold to tourists was kind of trapped in this old way. Now, these people, these artisans, these artists, they were influenced by the modern world too. They wanted to do other stuff that was influenced by what they saw around them, but they couldn't sell that to the tourists. And I was so struck by how that, in a way, put them in this prison, that what was authentic was this stuff that was confined. Not that it wasn't also amazing, because it is, but how those boxes didn't let them make a living in their own living culture.
Yeah, it gets. We also have had other conversations where we talk about the evil word authenticity, which can often be used as a weapon, usually by people who aren't even from the culture in question, saying this isn't authentic. And you're like, who are you? Do you even go here? No, you don't. Yeah. So another question from the audience, when writing worlds where the cosmology can clearly be mapped one-to-one with an existing culture, What are your thoughts on having the world also be inhabited by people who aren't just from that culture?
Can I take this one to start with then? Because I thought a lot about that, and since I wrote Star Daughter to be in this world, our world, I thought a lot about this. Could we do a version of like American gods, right? Like how do we do this? How do we have different mythologies, different faiths come together and coexist? And I know that it's been done, but I also think for me personally, I wanted to give my brown people the center stage. So I decided I was just not going to have anybody who wasn't Desi and Hindu in the book. And not to say they don't exist, that they're not out there, but I mean, well, there are a couple side characters, but beyond them. But so I think it's also a question of what you're trying to do. And so I'd definitely be interested to hear now what the rest of you have to say.
I'll just say something. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but yeah, I think that if you two things, again, we're back to this idea that cultures, mix, and so if you have a dominant culture and you have people who are not originally from the dominant culture within that culture, that happens. That makes sense. I think if you're writing and your dominant culture is like brown people, like people of color, just avoid things like the white savior complex. Avoid things like suddenly centering the story around the people who are not of that culture. If that's what you're doing, then it's problematic. If you are creating a story and the people whose mythology it are centered, then I think that's fine, at least in my opinion. The problem comes when all of a sudden, there's the white guy that shows up and knows better, or suddenly the rebel that will save the poor brown people from themselves, or the evil oppressor who is him. So that's where things I think get messy and where they get problematic, and that's what we've seen in the genre for a long time and continue to see. So I think that's maybe what people are pushing back against.
Adding to what Rebecca said, or no, write those people, but take a view where you're kind of mocking them. That's a little spiteful of me, but I would love to see something like that.
I think doing a role swap is a choice, or you could go and you can make each character have a reason for being there, right? Give them a backstory. Don't make them wallpaper. And make sure that every character you have there isn't just there for the sake of diversity, but you know why they're there. What's their story? Give them a story. Make them the hero of their own story. That's fine, because that will make your characters real and develop your characters fully. And therefore, their drivers are nuanced, and their drivers aren't simple, transparent things that make them good or bad. Instead, they become a part of the weft and weave of the story. And that is what I'm looking for more when I read, is I want to read this tapestry that spreads out in front of me. And I don't want a tapestry that is all one color or all one fabric, like all one fiber, right? Like, because it's not interesting to touch. It's not interesting to feel against your skin. It's not interesting to see. But if every character in your diverse world has a reason for being there and is a part of the weave, and they have a backstory, then I'm definitely more there for it. In addition to keeping in mind some of the things that we're seeing here that are options, right? Like I think we have enough white saviors, maybe give them a moment where people see themselves being mocked for once. Maybe people see themselves not having the dominant power in a power dynamic. Yeah, give them a taste of that, but also give a why. Like, make it a real character. Don't make it a martyr that has that's just picture or the sticker on the wall. Like, give them nuance and depth, because those are the best characters and those are the ones that will stick in people's minds. That's where you get fan fiction from, which is kind of goals for authors, even if we don't admit it.
Fan fiction is totally my goal. I'm not allowed to read it, I'm told. I'm not gonna.
Right? Like, we can't read it, but knowing it's out there is kind of cool. We're like, I've arrived.
I agree with all of you. One of the other things about writing true secondary worlds is that I think it's fine to map to kind of what I would call elements of Earth's history, because it's what we know best, but you don't have to map to that. And you can also make choices about, like, David Anthony Durham's Acacia is set, the ruling imperial family is kind of in a Mediterranean area. And then you look outward from there. One risk for writers is that they keep looking outward from Northern and Western Europe. Even if they think they're writing it differently, they're still looking from that perspective. So you have to pull yourself, if you're going to write a secondary world, if you want to, you need to pull yourself out of that perspective and look at it from, say, Acacia's perspective. Say, how would this look to them? Because the world doesn't have to, the South could be the colder place. Maybe there was no, maybe civilization developed such that there aren't people with blonde hair in your world. There don't have to be. There's reasons, environmental reasons, that people develop different phenotypic aspects, right? And you can dig down and decide what elements of those you want to have in your secondary world, and which you don't. Or you can decide that it matters enough to you to keep talking about what's going on in this world, because those things also matter. Like, as Shveta said, it matters that the brown people in your story, the story you're telling about Hindu mythology, it matters that those be seen and be visible. So just decide where you're starting from. That's what I would say.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are like a little bit over time, so not going to take any more questions. But before I close out, I want to ask all of my panelists to let us know where we can find you online. What is your website? What are your social media handles that you would be willing to share? So Shveta, let's start with you.
Okay, I tried to make mine as easy as possible. So my website is my first name, last name.com, shvetathakkrar.com. Twitter handle @Shveta Thakrar, Instagram @Shveta Thakrar.
Rebecca?
Same. No, that's not Shveta, but it's RebeccaRoanhorse.com, and I am on Twitter at RohnhorstBex, BX.
Piper?
PiperJDrake.com, author Piper J. Drake on Facebook. Twitter is Piper J. Drake. Instagram, Piper J. Drake. TikTok, Piper J. Drake. So I'm out there. Please say hi.
Vida? Oh, wait, you're still muted. You are still muted. That's weird. You weren't before. There you go.
Okay,
there we
there we
are.
All right. vidacruz.org is my website. I put my Twitter handle on my name. I know we were saying it was tacky earlier, but it's in French because 10 years ago I made it and I was young and stupid and haven't changed it yet. La vie c'est moi over there. And drop me a hint if you've got any more questions.
And Kate?
I love your Twitter handle, Vida.
Thank you.
So I'm on Twitter too much at Kate Elliott SFF, science fiction fantasy. Get it? Yeah. And like Shveta and Rebecca, I'm at kateelliott.com. It's my website. I have a Substack and a blog called I Make Up Worlds, which is I don't use often enough. That's where I am.
Awesome. And I will encourage you to go to all of their Twitters and go to other websites and buy their books. We have so many amazing books that are coming out, and I'm so excited. I mean, I read a very early version of Star Daughter, and so I can't wait to see the published version of Star Daughter, and I cannot wait for Black Sun, and I cannot wait for Unconquerable Sun, and I cannot wait for any of these books and all the books by all the people, because you guys are amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and for giving us this great gift. I super appreciate it. I want to mention again that this is a panel brought to you by the Carl Brandon Society, who wants more conversations that are as wonderful and deep as this between smart and talented people. So please support us by going to our website and either supporting us monetarily with a donation, or coming to more of these events, these virtual events, and supporting us by buying a ticket or by sharing. Share everywhere. Every time you see us posted about some stuff, just share it, because we basically want to keep doing this kind of work. We also have a scholarship fund, the Octavia E. Butler Memorial Scholarship Fund, that pays the entire tuition of one Black, Indigenous, or other person of color writer to go to Clarion and Clarion West each year. So like one person at Clarion, one person at Clarion West. And so your donations help support that. We also have literary awards, the Parallax and Kindred Awards. Your donations go to support that. And it also goes to support us doing more stuff like this and maybe other cooler things down the road. So please join us, come to our website, follow us on Twitter at Carl Brandon. And please join me on Twitter in thanking all of these lovely people for tonight, because this was really awesome. And I super appreciate all of you. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. All right.
Thank you, Tempest. And